So let's talk about the overall design of the bench hooks, and then we can get into the specifics of what goes into the parts. I know that this bench hook looks kind of small, and if you compare this bench hook to the one that I've been using for years, it is quite a bit smaller. It's about a third the size, but I built this bench hook for a different workbench, and that workbench had a different layout of Holdfast holes on it. And the reason the Holdfast hole layout is important is sometimes when you're cutting a part that's got an odd shape, or you're cutting a strange angle, and your body has to be in a strange position, it's nice to have a third hand to hold the parts down, and the Holdfast can do that for you. So if you had a part and you needed to grab it and you needed to stand off to this side to make the cut, you don't have to worry about holding on to it as much. So the reason that affects the size of the bench hook is you want to be able to make sure your bench hook is going to slip behind or in between the front edge of your bench and the inside face of that Holdfast. If it won't clear, then it gets in the way of your parts, and you can't use it for longer parts that are any wider than this. So when in the process of building these new bench hooks, I'm building them for this specific bench. I'm going to make one wide and one narrow, but you can just as easily make a pair of large hooks. I don't think you're going to want a pair of small hooks if you're going to use it for more than just cutting. The next thing we should talk about is the arrangement of the parts. This is the main workhorse of the bench hook, the pair of bench hooks that I'm going to make. This side is the cutting side. So how do I know that it's the cutting side? I'm a right-hander, and the fence stops short of the right-hand side. And that allows me to make cuts without the saw going off the edge of the bench hook. The whole purpose here is to keep your saw from digging into the workbench while you're making cuts, and also give you something to push against when you're sawing so that you can hold the work steady. On the other side, this is the shooting board side. And what I've got here is a fence that runs all the way to the edge. And what that allows me to do is use a hand plane as a shooting plane and not have to worry about blowout on this back side here when I'm cutting with the hand plane. The other thing about this particular design is it is ambidextrous. So if a lefty were to come up and want to cut, they would use my shooting board side as their cutting side, and then if they were to flip it over, they would have something to shoot against. I don't know that you need to do that in your shop, but I have students here occasionally, and it's nice to build pieces that can be used for everyone while they're here. The other part is just a second hook, and the distance of these hooks between the inside of this face and the inside of that face on these two is the same. So that way, if I have a longer part and I'm spanning across these two, I can push anywhere on that part between those two hooks, and I can get a nice solid foundation to push on. So let's talk about the specifics of the materials. The base, you can use just about anything. You can use solid wood as long as it's a relatively stable solid wood. You do have grain going in two different directions here, so you want to make sure you account for that movement, allow for some slotted openings for the screws to move. The easy way out of that is just to use plywood. I like to use a thicker plywood like this 3/4 inch plywood. The thicker plywood gives you a little bit more clearance when you're cutting before the tip of the saw starts to dip into the workbench. With this other one here, I used thinner material, something more like 3/8 or 1/2 inch, and the tip of the saw occasionally touches the workbench. So to address that this time around, I decided to go with a little bit thicker plywood for the base. And one thing about plywood that I've noticed, that I'm sure you have too, is that it usually cups or bows in one dimension. And so when you're planning to cut your parts, you want to make sure that that bow or cup is running across the dimension where the fence is going to go, and that will let the fence flatten that piece for you. This will be nice and straight because it's naturally straight, and the part that's bowed will get flattened out by the fences. And you want to make sure all the plywood is the same thickness. If you don't have the same height, cut them all out of the same sheet. If you don't have the same height, you're going to have all kinds of problems when you start using them in pairs. The fence can be another strip of plywood if you want, but I like solid wood and I like quarter sawn wood. The reason I like solid wood for a fence is if you're going to be using one side of this hook for a shooting board, there is a chance, even if you use good quarter sawn material, that the fence will go out of square. And I like having solid wood so that I can use a shoulder plane to change that angle and get these two faces true and square to each other. It's just so much easier to do that with solid wood than it is with plywood. And then that kind of leads into the whole idea of using quarter sawn material. Quarter sawn material moves more in this dimension, with the grain at the rings than it does across the rings. So it's a little less likely to go out of square if it's quarter sawn material. The only other really consideration you need to make is the thickness. If you plan to use this as a planing stop for small parts, make sure that your fence is going to end up lower than your average part that you work with on a regular basis. You want to make sure your plane can pass right past the end of that fence. And we're going to be using screws to attach this, glue and screws to attach this to the base. So it's not something you can plane down later. If you do that, you're going to run into your screws. So plan for that in advance and decide what thickness you're going to need for your stop. Another small detail that I've included in this design on the fence is a small undercut chamfer on where the fence meets the base. This is handy to keep little bits of sawdust and chips from causing problems, keeping your work from registering properly against the fence when you're using this for a shooting board.